teaching. So please, help me welcome Rabbi Merrill Shapiro.
I'm going to call me Merrill, but that's okay.
Oh.
But there we are. Thank you. Again, you took away my adjectives, but I'm honored and flattered to be asked, and it's a joy to come and stand in front of what we in Judaism refer to as a holy congregation. That we are a sacred convocation. We have come together for holy purposes, and that is important. No.
There you go.
Okay, so this is me. Should you ever have any questions or anything, or want to dispute anything I'm about to say, by the way, we as Jews, this old saying is that two Jews on a street corner arguing represent at least three opinions, and therefore you are more than welcome to argue, and it's from that interaction that we learn from each other. That's so very important. Yeah.
Merrill will take all your questions after the service. We'll set up some chairs over there. Is that all right, Charlotte?
The other side, well, then look at the, by the way, so you're always welcome to questions. I'm here with my wife, Robin, in the back. I was so impressed that some of you remembered that just that when you saw me, so how was Robin and so on. She's here. And so I'm going, this is my rebuttal to Tim is we, of course, and you've heard me say this before, have two daughters, Sarah and Amy, and because we raised them through their teenage years, actually, if you want to make me feel most at home, you'll interrupt me while I'm speaking. So it is true, we can, and I know that there are people here who don't get often a chance to talk to a rabbi or ask a rabbi questions. We can and talk all you'd like afterward, but if there's something that comes up, feel free to interrupt me. Number one, and number two, no question, no point is out of bounds. I do not get offended, and in fact, only by the free interchange. And we all need to feel free to speak with one another in cities. So, in the we have a new moon. We have a full moon coming up next week. The following full moon, and among Jews will gather in the synagogues to read together the scroll of Esther, which is part of the biblical canon. Oh, you can see it very well. So, first of all, I don't like the names Old Testament and New Testament. I would even argue, perhaps, that there is some anti-Semitic intent in there, and I think I've mentioned here before, you could feel that if you wanted to call them actually the First Testament and the Second Testament. And if you really want to be difficult, you can call it the Primary Testament and the Secondary Testament. It's not a nice thing, and I don't recommend it. And so, and I'd like not to confuse the Old Testament from the Hebrew Scriptures, because the order of the books in the Hebrew Scriptures is different, and they're there in the Old Testament for tendentious reasons as well that are beyond the scope of what everybody wants to go home at some point this afternoon. So we'll leave it at that. So the books that the law, it says, I don't know that that's law, but it says Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, the 5 books of Moses, the Pentateuch, 5, and following that has a shelf that says history. It says Joshua, Judges, Ruth, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles. I'm going to read what it says in the rest. But the far right book is called Esther. And it is what we will read again when we gather, not this coming full moon next week, but the following full moon. We will read again the scroll of Esther, because the scroll itself indicates that the events that happened took place on the 15th day of the Hebrew month of Adar. The 15th day of every Hebrew month is a full moon. The first and last day of every Hebrew month is a new moon. We base ourselves, we have a lunar calendar. And so we'll gather together and actually read from a scroll that looks like this, written on parchment by someone who uses a quill. Usually they prefer turkey feathers. and the ink of the bezel nut and write it on parchment by hand, making sure every word is there. It's somewhat fragile, but not fragile enough that I'm not willing to pass it around and you can take a look at it. It reads from right to left. If it means that you'll get you know what, the heavy wood put goes on the left, that way you'll get upside. You won't know if we're upside down or right side up. It's ancient Hebrew. Pardon me. And it begins. So here's the scroll. It's called Megillat Esther. In Hebrew, not important. Here is the text. So it begins by, so you'll recognize it when you hear it. Vayehi b'yemei Achashverosh, hu Achashverosh, hamolech me'hodu v'yakush, sheva v'yasrimu me'ash medina. It came to pass, and I apologize for reading stuff that's right there that you can read as well, but it is the biblical text, and we should become familiar with it. I'm going to go as quickly as I can, but again, you may interrupt me at any time. By the way, if we go back, it was on the shelf listed as history. There's precious little history. It is not, in Judaism, the historicity of the biblical text is just not that important. We don't have to take the text literally. The text is asking us to take it seriously. Not literally, but seriously. And that has implications for lots of reading of the text. So this is a book that is not historical, and there's no sense in looking for most of the characters who are here mentioned in this book. But King Ahasuerus is King Artaxerxes of Persia, who ruled in around 525 years, 100 years before the Common Era is called. And he did, in fact, extend his kingdom from India unto Ethiopia, 127 provinces. Verse 2, that in those days when King Ahasuerus sat on the throne of the kingdom, which was in Shushan, the palace, and I'll show you where Susa is in a little bit, in the 3rd year of his reign, he made a feast unto all the princes and servants, all the powers of Persia and Media, the nobles, the princes of provinces going before him, when he showed the riches of the glorious kingdom and the honor of his excellent majesty many days. And this party, this feast, wine and all, by the way, went on for how long? 104. Okay, into 104 score, 180 days. The new party that lasted 180 days? Yeah, no, okay. And King Ahasuerus sounds like, hey, let's go. And it begins the story of Ahasuerus, the party boy. So Susa, there's a map on the left on the Persian Gulf. We still know where it is and its ruins, and we can reconstruct the palace of that time. That's what it looked like in that time, even though, again, this story is not historical. I'll explain why in a minute. So when these 180 days were up, the king made a feast for all the people, not just for the leaders of the 147 provinces in Shushan the palace, great and small, 7 days for the garden of the king's palace. There were all sorts of decorative and beautiful things. And most importantly, in verse 7, they gave them drink in vessels of gold. It was the common people. There was, and I left off, but there was drink for everybody according to their desires. Anybody could have as much wine to drink as they wish. Also, Vashti, the queen, Ahasuerus' queen, made a feast for women in the royal house, which belonged to the king Ahasuerus. Men and women didn't party together. It wasn't really right. But on the 7th day, in the bigger party, when the heart of the king was merry with wine, he commanded 7 chamberlains. They'll use the word chamberlain here because they didn't like the word eunuch. But who else was able to go into the queen's quarters but eunuchs? And they served the presence of the king. And he commanded they bring, verse 11, Vashti the queen before the king with the royal crown, or it was really in the Hebrew, in the royal crown, to show the people and the princes her beauty, for she was fair to look upon. Medieval commentators note that Vashti is being asked to come in the royal crown and nothing else. and in the royal crown and nothing else. So, what do we have? The Queen Vashti refused to come at the king's, and this is the king, at the king's commandment, and by his eunuchs who he sent in. Therefore, the king was very wroth, and his anger burned within him. Okay? A woman has to do what her husband tells her to do, and Vashti refused. So what are the implications of that? The king and the wise men who knew the times, for so is the king's manner to the Lord's judgment. Next to him, and here are the names of the name them, we'll say that, which the kings saw the king's face, they were met with the king face to face. Verse 15, they came up with the question, what shall we do with Queen Vashti according to the law? Because she has not performed the commandment of her husband, King Ahasuerus, brought to her by these eunuchs. And Memucan answered before the king and the princes that Vashti, the king, has done wrong not just to the king, but also to the princes, and it's cut off here, but not only to the princes, but to all the men of these 127 kingdoms. Why? Because if somebody asks their wife to do something, they'll say, you know, Vashti didn't have to do it for Ahasuerus. Why should I, make your own sandwich? You don't need me to do it. And destroy the order of things in these 127 provinces. So if it pleased the king, let there go out a royal commandment, let it be written in the laws of Persia to the Medes, and not changed, that Vashti come no more. She's fired from her job as the king Ahasuerus, and that the king gives her royal estate to another that's better than she is, who will be more obedient. And when the king's decree, which was made, shall be published throughout his empire, all the wives will then give their husbands honor, both great and small. And because in the end, women have to honor their husbands, right? Yeah. After these things, when the wrath of Ahasuerus was appeased, he remembered Vashti and what she had done, and what was decreed against her. And then said the king's servants and ministers, let fair young virgins be sought for the king, and let the king appoint officers and provinces of all the kingdom, that they may go forth, gather all the fair young virgins at the Shushan palace, to the house of the women, unto the custody of Hagar, the king's chamberlain, a keeper of the woman's area. He's as well a eunuch. Now in Shushan the palace, there happens to have been a certain Jew whose name was Mordecai. By the way, Mordecai is too close to the Babylonian god Marduk. And so Mordecai is Marduk, and it's one of the reasons why we know that this is a made-up story, but it does come to teach us some important things about whether women should listen to their husbands, I suppose, or obey their husbands. That's what it is. It's also important that he is the son of Yair, the son of Shidi, the son of Kish, a Benjamite, although his lineage is important, but we won't get to it here, I don't think. He had been carried away from Jerusalem with the captivity which had carried away with Yehoniah, the son of the king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, carried away. That exile happens in 586 before the Common Era. That's a historic event. People were exiled to Persia, and Mordecai's family was part of that exile. And he happens to have brought up his niece, Hadassah. In Persia, she was known as Esther. Think of Ishtar, Esther, and so that is his uncle's daughter. And she had neither father nor mother, but she was fair and beautiful, and Mordecai had adopted her when her father and mother died. So it came to pass when the king's commandment and his decree was heard, and many maidens were gathered unto Shushan the palace, all these virgins, to the custody of Haggai. Esther was brought also to the king's house to the custody of Haggai, the keeper of women, and the maiden pleased him, Haggai, the head eunuch. And she obtained kindness from him, and he speedily gave her the things for purification, that is, all the colognes, perfumes, and this other stuff that would make her seem, as the king likes this kind of perfume, and the king likes that, and he would guide her. And then it was a turn, so you can imagine every night a different virgin is brought to the king, and the king will decide in the morning, by the way, whether or not this woman should be the queen to follow Vashti. Now the turn of Esther, the story of Abihail, the uncle of Mordecai, whose uncle Mordecai had taken for a daughter, was come to the king. She required nothing but what Haggai, the king's chamberlain, the king's eunuch, said. And Esther obtained favor in sight, and all who looked upon her. Esther was taken into King Ahasuerus in his royal house in the 10th month of the Hebrew month of Tevet, of the 7th year of his reign. Actually, it's a Babylonian month. Esther had not yet shown or didn't tell anybody that she was kindred or part of the Jewish people, as Mordecai had told her, keep that a secret. And for Esther did the commandment of Mordecai, like as when she was brought up with him. She obeyed Mordecai. In those days, while Mordecai sat at the king's gate, it happens that he was hanging around the gate to see what would happen with whether Esther would go in and whether she would come out, or whether the king would choose her to be queen. In those days, while Mordecai sat at the king's gate, happens to be two of the king's eunuchs by the name of Bigtan and Teresh, who kept the door, were angry with the king, and they sought to assassinate King Ahasuerus. And these king and Mordecai tells Esther, and Esther rats out Bigtan and Teresh, and it's recorded, it's noted in the book of Chronicles of what the kings of Persia at the time. So it's just listed there. Chapter 3, after these things, King Ahasuerus promoted Haman, the son of Hamdatha the Agagite, advanced him in the seat above all the princes that were with him. Essentially, he became the prime minister. He was the #1 minister. Haman's descended from a group called the Amalekites, who were known to have attacked the children of Israel after they crossed the Sea of Reeds, the Red Sea, leaving Egypt. When they were tired, they had just escaped slavery. They were attacked. They are perennial enemies of the Jewish people. We can now rip that from the headlines and decide what that means and how it speaks to us today. All the king's servants that were at the king's gate bowed and revered Haman, for the king had so commanded him, but Mordecai and Jews in general bowed not, nor did pay him any reverence. So I said, yeah, this is being cut off, but all right. So Haman saw that Mordecai bowed not and didn't hold him in reverence, and it made Haman angry. And he thought scorn to lay hands on Mordecai alone, for he had showed him the people of Mordecai. Wherefore Haman said, it's not just Mordecai, we need to get rid of all of the Jews. So Haman sought to destroy all the Jews that were out throughout the entire kingdom of Ahasuerus, that's the people of Mordecai, all 127 provinces. And again, that's cut off, but maybe that's okay too. So Haman went to Ahasuerus and said, there's this certain people scattered amongst us and dispersed among the people of the provinces of your kingdom. Their laws are different from the other people, and they don't really keep the king's laws. Therefore, there's no reason, it doesn't profit the king to suffer them to have them around. If it please the king, let it be written that they may be destroyed. And Haman will pay 10,000 talents of silver into the hands of those who are in charge of the business to bring it into the king's treasury. And the king liked that idea, and the king agrees. And the king's scribes called on the 13th day of the month. They wrote according to all that Haman had said, and to all the governors of every province, the rulers of every people, every province, each according to their language and according to their custom. The letters were sent by horse, by post people to every province. Everyone knew that it was time to rid the kingdom, rid all 127 provinces of the Jewish people, the people of Mordecai. When Mordecai learned of what had been done, Mordecai rent his clothes, tore it, it's a sign of mourning, and of course puts on sackcloth and ashes, which is also a sign of mourning, and went out into the midst of the city and cried with a loud and bitter cry, and came before the king's gate. But none might enter the king's gate clothed in sackcloth. Ahasuerus remains the party boy, doesn't like to deal with death and people in mourning and people who are sad. Everything has to be good and happy, and all that other stuff, forget about it. So in every province where the king's commandment decreed, there was a great mourning amongst the Jews, fasting and weeping and wailing, and many had put on sackcloth and ashes. And Mordecai told him of all that happened unto him, and the money that Haman had promised to pay the king's treasures and to destroy them. This is when what was missing was Esther sent the messengers out to Mordecai and says, change back into regular clothes. No mourning is permitted. You're putting yourself in danger. And Mordecai tells this servant all that happened. And Mordecai gives a copy of the writing of the decree that was given in Shushan to destroy them, to show it unto Esther, and declare it unto her to charge Esther that she should go into the king and make supplication unto him, the king, and to make a request for him before him and for her people, for the Jewish people. And they told to Mordecai Esther's words, and Mordecai and Esther said, I can't go into the king because no one's allowed to go into the king unless the king calls them, except on one condition: if the king sees you entering. By the way, this was to avoid assassinations. But if the king sees you and holds out the royal scepter, then you may enter into the king's chamber. The phallic nature of the scepter, we'll say for another time. So Mordecai commanded to answer Esther, think not of yourself that you're going to escape in the king's house more than when all the Jews are destroyed. They're going to find out about you, and you're going to be destroyed with them. For if you hold your peace at this time, if you say, I can't go into the king, nobody's allowed to come into the king unless they're called, and I can't do it, then deliverance will arise from some other place. It's a natural place to mention the name of God, but because it's not a real story, because it's a fiction, and let's not shortchange fiction. Fiction can teach us a great deal. Because it's a fiction, the author avoids using the name of God, and this is one of two books in the Bible that do not mention the name of God. The other is the Song of Songs, the Song of Solomon, which even in antiquity was regarded as biblical pornography. So you may want to run out and Song of Songs, Song of Solomon. Now it came to pass on the third day that people were Esther said, I'll go. Everybody please fast and pray for me that I am successful, and instead of being beheaded because I tried to approach the king without permission. So Esther puts on a royal apparel, stood in the inner court of the king's house over against the king's house, and the king sat on his throne in the royal house over against the gate of the house. And verse 2, and it was so when the king saw Esther the queen standing in the court, that she obtained favor in his sight. And the king held out to Esther the golden scepter that was in his hand, and Esther drew near and touched the top of the scepter. Then the king said to her, what, by the way, the king answers her the way Jewish husbands, all husbands must answer their wives from this time on. Says, what do you want? Half the kingdom. If that's, if your wife calls you, says to you in the middle of the night, please get up and bring me a drink of water, you're to say, half the kingdom, whatever you would like, you can have this. And so the king says, what wilt thou, Esther? What is your request? It shall be given to thee even unto half the kingdom. And Esther answered, if it seems good for the king, that the king and Haman, this bad guy prime minister, come this day unto the banquet that I have prepared for them. And the word banquet is code for we're going to eat a little and drink a lot. And the king said to Esther at this banquet of wine, what is it that you want? You must want something, Esther. Whatever you want, it shall be granted you. What is your request? Even up to half the kingdom, it shall be performed. Again, the way husbands are supposed to respond to wives. Then answered Esther, my petition and my request is this. If I found favor in the sight of the king and bring my petition, then let the king and Haman come tomorrow to my house for another banquet. And of course, when Ahasuerus hears the word banquet, he says, and that's wine, and let's go party some more. So Haman went home and told of how Queen Esther invited me to be there with it at this banquet. That's the glory of my riches, the multitude of my total, all the things wherein the king has promoted him. And now he advanced him above the other princes and servants. He told his family, see how good I am. And Haman said, moreover, yet even Esther the queen did let no man come in with the king to the banquet that she had prepared but me. And tomorrow I'm invited also to go with the king to see Esther. So they've got the next day, they've got this party. In the middle of that night, the king couldn't sleep. So he commanded that they bring the book of records of Chronicles, and they read it before the king. And it was found that Mordecai had told about those two eunuchs, Bigtan and Teresh, two of the king's chamberlains, the keepers of the door, who sought to lay hands on the king Ahasuerus. And the king said, what honor and dignity has been done to Mordecai? How has he been rewarded? And then the king's servants, the minister, said, there's been nothing done. No, he's done no reward. And the king said, who's in the court? Who's outside waiting? And now Haman had come into the king's house to speak unto the king about getting permission to hang Mordecai on the gallows he had prepared for him. And the king's servant said, behold, Haman's in the court. And the king said, oh, bring him in. And Haman comes in, and the king says, what shall be done unto the man that the king delights to honor? Now Haman, of course, thought in his heart, to whom would the king delight to do honor more than me, more than myself? And Haman answered the king, for the man whom the king delighted to honor, let some of the royal clothes be brought, which the king used to wear, and he ride on the horse of the king, and the crown be placed on his head, and let this apparel and horse be delivered to the hand of one of the king's most noble princes, that they may array the man with all whom the king delighted to honor, and bring him and lead him forth through the town, through Shushan, the capital, on a horse, and say, this is what is done to a person whom the king wants to honor. And the king said to Haman, great idea. Make haste, take the apparel, the horse, just as you have said, and do it to Mordecai the Jew. Okay? That sits in the king's gate. Mordecai seems to have been loitering around, had nothing to do but hang around the king's gate, but nothing failed of all that you have spoken. Okay? So Haman was going to hang Mordecai, and Mordecai winds up receiving the honors of the king. Then took Haman the apparel and the horse and arrayed Mordecai and brought him on horseback through the street of the city, proclaimed before him, this shall be done to the man whom the king delighteth to honor. So the king and Haman came to the banquet with Esther the queen. And the king again said to Esther, Esther, what is your petition? What will be granted to you? What is your request? It shall be performed, even unto half the kingdom. And Esther the queen answered, if I have found favor in your sight, grant me my life and the life of my people, for we are soon to be destroyed. And King Ahasuerus answered and said to the queen, who is he and where is he that does presume to do something like that? And Esther said, the adversary, the enemy is this wicked Haman, who was all excited about being invited to the party. Queen, all of a sudden, Haman is the one. And Haman was afraid before the king and queen. And the king arose from the banquet of wine, the roll of wine, and in his wrath went to the palace garden to take a breather for a minute. Haman stood up to make a request for his life from Esther the queen. Okay? Begging from a woman is also an issue here. Haman, number 2 in the kingdom, doesn't like the idea that he has to beg for his life from a woman, for Haman saw the evil that was determined by the king. Then the king returned out of the palace garden into the banquet of wine, and Haman had fallen on the bed whereon Esther was. And the king said, did you want to force yourself on the queen while I was still here in the house? And the word went out of the king's mouth, and as a euphemism, Haman's face turned white, as you might expect. Then Harbonah, one of the king's chamberlains before the king, came into the party to tell Haman the gallows that's 50 cubits, 75 feet high, which Haman has made for Mordecai, it's ready. And the king said, don't hang Mordecai on it, hang Haman on it. And so the order went out to slay, but the order had already gone out to slay all the Jews on the 15th day of the month of Adar. What should be done? What course of action should be taken? And here's where we might see some correspondence with what goes on today, what's going on in the world today. The Jews arm themselves and rise up in self-defense from those who wanted to kill them. And there is a great battle in which the Jews are victorious. Why did Haman not like the Jews? They were different. Intolerant of anybody. They had different laws and different rules, and they do things in different ways. I don't know, I've been sort of cautioned a little bit, so I won't talk about the southern border and people. They speak a different language, and so I said, no. Why is God not mentioned in the scroll of Esther? It's not a real story. It's not to be taken literally, but it is to be taken seriously. Both in the realm of elevating women, and women are just not there to make sandwiches and cook for and do the laundry for men, and in the idea that there were people, believe it or not, who were intolerant of those who were different from them. And we cannot allow anyone, not allow ourselves or anyone else to be intolerant of other people just because they're in different guys. And so, have you ever had a Haman in your life? Right? It was difficult and so on. How did you deal with that Haman? That's something we can talk about at the end, in the back of the room, and when you'll be free to answer questions. Were you familiar with this book of the Bible, this story? Oh, you are? Okay, good. Well, some were, some are not. Comes to teach us a great deal. Even if it's not literally true, it needs to be taken seriously. Thank you.
Thank you, Merrill. We look forward to talking some more with you. That's terrific. Closing words this morning by Shanti Deva, was an 8th century Indian philosopher, Buddhist monk, poet, and scholar. May I become at all times, both now and forever, a protector of those without protection, a guardian for those who have lost their way, a ship for those with oceans to cross, a bridge for those with rivers to cross, a sanctuary for those in danger, a lamp for those without light, and a place of refuge for those who lack shelter, and a servant of all in need. For as long as space endures, and for as long as living beings remain, until then, may I too abide to dispel the misery of the world.